My name is Katarzyna Kopecka-Piech, and I represent Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. And today we have a great honor and pleasure to have an opportunity to listen to the lecture of Andrew Hoskins. Professor Andrew Hoskins works at the University of Glasgow. He is a professor of global security. He is also an expert during today's workshop towards development of mediatization research. This year's edition is about war, so we are talking about mediatization of war. Thank you, Andrew, for the acceptance of this invitation. Thank you that you also agreed to open this lecture, to make it open for the public, for anyone who is interested in this very current and important topic, not only in this part of Europe, but I suppose for many, many people. Thank you also. I would like to say a few words to people who made this even possible, especially Wroclaw Academic Center, Wroclaw hub of Academia Europaea, and my great colleagues who are with us, Mateusz Sobiech and Anna Jeschowa. Thank you very much, guys. I'm very happy that there are people are joining. So I believe in a few minutes there will be the audience will be full. Let me explain that if you have any kind of technical problems during our meeting, Mateusz is here to support you. Mateusz can answer your questions, so you can contact him, and we'll try to solve all issues to make this lecture effective and comfortable for everyone. So I would like to give floor to Andrew. Once again, thank you, and we are listening to your speech now.
Katarzyna, thank you so much for organizing this event. I know how much work goes into this, an incredible amount of work, and it's a real honor and privilege to give this lecture. And thanks also to Mateusz for getting us all the technical stuff right and making sure it's all working. Thank you to him too. Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate you tuning in, and it sounds like a really amazing day ahead. So I really look forward to listening to the papers in the workshop. So I'll share my screen in a minute, but just to say that I'll begin with a kind of definition of mediatization, and then look at some of the theories of the relationship between war and media, at least some recent kind of models. And then I'll go on to explore these ideas further through a kind of lens on this year's Russian war against Ukraine. And the history of mediatization is, in many people's work, I think, a growing entanglement with self, society, in my work, War and Memory, with the media of the day. So let me just share my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see that?
Yes,
yep.
We can see.
Great, okay, thank you. Sorry about the delay. So here's a popular definition of mediatization there, courtesy of Livingston. And here's one of mine. And for me, mediatization is really a matter of this word here, dependency. The shift from reliance to dependency on tech and media, for identity and work and memory and war, and how and why this happened, is a story that defines our age. And there was definitely a tipping point to this shift. But of course, we really didn't notice this. However, we can see mediatization of warfare since the late 20th century, I think, as more ebb and flow, a kind of modulation between forms of control and forms of chaos in terms of how media shape perception and action, rather than just as a singular trajectory. Across this kind of entire period, however, there's a general trend in what communication technologies and media are and what they do, from a kind of punctual, occasional and distant appearance in our lives to something more continuous and intrusive and inescapable. And most usefully perhaps this can be considered in terms of perceptions of war. And today's perception, I think, has even been hacked in terms of representation is in crisis. And this is challenging how meaning is generated and the effects of war are understood. Perhaps the mediatization of war can be said to have been displayed by the weaponization of warfare. So some recent theories of warfare then. A lot of work around war media has been based upon this kind of late 20th century idea of broadcast war. And then we come to a kind of a more uncertain period as digital technologies take hold, and Ben and O'Loughlin's and mine idea about diffuse war in the 2000s. 2010, we have arrested war. A few minutes ago, I was talking about this modulation. There's this kind of pushback where militaries and mainstream media kind of grappled with and grasped the kind of more chaos of emergent social and digital media and appropriated it. So they kind of pushed back, and there's more, again, this modulation between chaos and control. And then I think 2020s, thereafter, Matthew Ford is with us today. We have something a bit more different, a bit more intense. And I'll talk about this throughout this lecture. But I think one of the problems is how these developments rupture our capacity to actually make sense of what's going on. So I think, in terms of perceptions of war, this is probably the quote that I've used most in my entire career. It's in every war and media book that I've ever written or co-written, and I think this is, still holds today. The history of battle is primarily the history of radically changing fields of perception. And as I said a few minutes ago, I think this notion of perception has been hacked, and challenging how meaning is generated and the effects of war are understood. So today I want to talk about this idea, this new idea in some ways. I mean, when Matthew Ford and I wrote this book, Radical War, that was published just before the onset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we just wondered, oh my word, what's going to happen now? And some of the theories and models we were using, how would they play out? And what certainly can be said is how this war, the Russian war against Ukraine, has evolved in terms of media and technology terms in very interesting ways, and how the media ecology has adapted and been appropriated. So for me, the war feed is a new spectrum of war. It's located in and through messaging apps and platforms. It is how individual locating and targeting and surveillance and psychological ops, trolling and disinformation are all enabled through digital networks and streams and archives. And these aspects of war thrive precisely because of the rapid growth in recording and sharing of all those on the battlefield. All this clicking and swiping and linking and liking, emoting, sharing stories and messages and images, memes and videos, and the smartphone is made for war. And this is a theme that Matthew Ford has picked up in some of his work. And whereas the media of the 20th century produced content for us, the audience to consume, there's a reversal in this relationship. Platforms give us the tools to produce ourselves. And prior to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, the availability and affordability and pervasiveness of the smartphone had already re-engineered the battlefield as participative. This blurs the line between citizen and bystander and soldier and aid worker, victim and journalist, as they capture and share and snap and message and link and like all the ordinary and the extraordinary experiences. And for me, I think you can say that never before has a war been so apparently accessible in terms of images and videos of the suffering, the injured, the captured, the mutilated and dead, civilians and soldiers, bystanders and journalists. And, never before, I don't think, has there been so much information and disinformation available about war in real time, via smartphones and satellites, shared via chat and messaging apps. But, it's completely wrong to call the Russian war against Ukraine in any way transparent. For me, open source has always been a misnomer. This is more like crowdsourced war, a war in which the claims and opinions and outrage of anyone who can post or share on social media splinter multiple realities of experience. And immediately we can see that social media is too generic a term. And so what we have is this adaptation and exploitation of pre-existing media ecologies over the course of the war. And of course, there's a long history of media ecology, from Postman to McLuhan, how media communication affect human perception and understanding and feeling and value, and how our interaction with media facilitates or impedes our chances of survival. So ecology is about this study of environments, their structure, their content, their impact on people. But today, these ecologies are much more convoluted and complex, distinct yet connected apps and platforms which enable entirely different versions of this war to be perceived and participated and fought over, but also paradoxically rendered invisible. Telegram and TikTok, for instance, are entirely different platforms in the kind of war that is accessible and representable, entire media ecologies, and how they generate war, how they're moderated or not, how algorithms are used or not, how they are plugged into the battlefield. So, I call this an advanced kind of subscription war. You choose to subscribe to your own tailored version of war in your feed or avoid it altogether. This makes it the most personalized war in history. Even on platforms where algorithms are less influential, individuals still subscribe to channels offering a highly personalized version of war. And it is on Telegram in which this kind of war thrives, at the heart of the digital battlefield between Ukraine and Russia, used by more than 70% of Ukrainians and a quarter of Russians. Another key feed of the war feed that I'm interested in particular is the ways in which it delivers either the most or the least sanitized war in history. Of course, soldiers and others have in many wars taken illicit and disturbing so-called trophies of battle from and of those they've killed or captured, even of bodies of their own size fallen, such as images and objects. But these images and objects usually take years or decades before they're discovered, talked about, shared to a wider audience, for instance, in films or documentaries or exhibitions in much later memory booms. Yet on Telegram, there's a stream of what can only be described as war porn. Never have so many images and videos of the suffering and injured and captured, mutilated and dead been so freely and continuously pouring out from the battlefield. For example, the Look for Your Own channel was created by the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine to identify captured and killed soldiers of the Russian army, unadulterated photos and videos of the dismembered bodies of presumably Russian soldiers and captives, but also the bodies of civilians, including naked children. This is a channel you can choose to or not to subscribe to, but which has 750,000 subscribers. These posts are copied and shared, emojied. And here's a Russian version of this channel. This is channel No Cola by Tuba. It has 95,000 subscribers. Excuse me. So this post is taken the 14th of July, and the translation from Russian is something like, we have another mix of these ghostly fighters of the armed forces of Ukraine who did not want to stay in the world of the living, did not lay down their arms, did not raise their hands, their choice, and only them. These strange people had plenty of time to make the right decision. It's all their fault. It's all their fault, in other words. Yet these splinters of horror do not dent the highly sanitized vision of war in mainstream news and on many social media platforms that edit and moderate a version of war that is presumed to be much more acceptable or tolerable for their viewers and users. And, maybe this is just an intensification of a long-standing relationship between a mainstream vision of the world, including that found on many social media platforms, and what is available around the edges. For most, the worst, the horror of war is pushed to the corner of the eye, rarely brought into focus. And this also highlights the void between a debate over the responsibility and control of companies over their social media platforms in terms of the content that's visible and that which is not, and the free-for-all that is Telegram. And I really do think that there's little point, in raging against, these debates about ineffectual moderation policies and mechanisms, and all the algorithmic production and exacerbation of hatred that we, in the West at least, debate endlessly and try to legislate poorly for, whilst the world burns on Telegram. There's nothing nuanced or tempered or obscured in the streaming the mutilated and dead on some Telegram channels. This is psychological war in plain sight. But this is nonetheless, for most at least, buried beneath the layers and the splinters of the war feed. Telegram is the perfect example of how war accelerates into media. This particular media ecology is a new battle space in which participants exploit extreme, unregulated, uncensored, and unsanitized opportunities to push their version and vision of war. Telegram, like many media ecologies, is highly connected to an array of other media, including mainstream platforms, to and from which content is shared and reused and repurposed and re-weaponized. Yet Telegram is also a highly contained ecology of media, it being in a place where anything goes, streaming the most graphic images of human abuse and injury and death, ever disseminated from a war so immediately, so continuously, in such a scale, at least in terms of the volume of images and video and the number of subscribers. So whilst the continuous stream of this war in the war feed shapes immediate perception on the ground and around the globe, I now turn to consider, some of the trajectories of this astonishing glut of digital media content of war. So, for me, we can already see this as the most documented war in history. And I can talk more about that during the Q&A afterwards, if you want me to. So I'll come into what all of these thousands and thousands of posts and channels and media ecologies add up to for the future in a while. But firstly, though, who are the media actors on Telegram all participated in war? Well, they were kind of aggregators of other Telegram channel content. I'll give you an example. Colonel Kassad, originally a personal channel of an independent Russian journalist, Boris Rosin. He was originally from the Crimean city of Sevastopol. He's a sincere supporter of Russian world doctrine and believes that the Cold War never ended. And now is the time for kind of Russian revival. And he was part of the official propaganda machine, more of an enthusiast who sincerely believes that this war is a just war. And he quickly became the key Telegram pro-Russian channel with 500,000 subscribers or so. But before that, he was a #1 communist blogger in LiveJournal. In May 2021, he had 52,000 subscribers. So now he's nearer three-quarters of a million. And he invented the meme Polite People, which describes Russian special forces who took Crimea without officially recognizing their Russian affiliation. So here's a really good example of what I was talking about a few minutes ago, where a former blogger becomes something very different in the war context. An appropriation or a reappropriation of existing kind of media ecologies by various actors in war. Crowdsourcing funding campaigns for humanitarian assistance or military equipment, drones and advanced optics and bulletproof vests. Individuals have set their own hobby, commercial drones, to help Ukraine build its army of drones to help with reconnaissance. And OSINT, of course, and originally visually driven content. The third category I would say is in terms of Telegram media actors, the war gonzo. This is what I was just talking a few minutes ago. The psyops, the look for your own Russian example I've given, as well as a number of soldier frontline blogs and other Russian activists, and then a number of bloggers. And this comes from all sides, and I've met a few of these, just young Ukrainian bloggers, that were just blogging about all kinds of cultural and normal aspects of life before the war, have turned their attention to the war. So all contributing on Telegram. So what then does this all leave us of the record and memory and history of this war? Where does it all go? And this battle, of course, is also with digital platforms and algorithms, wielding power without accountability in their supreme capacity to determine what is searchable and censored or erased. And, platforms and apps differ markedly in what can be downloaded and archived and analyzed and remembered and what will not. So we have the relatively inarchivable TikTok, the very archivable Telegram, shaping different media ecologies of memory. Is how digital technologies enable or disable individuals, organizations, groups, or whoever to, what I would say, encode memories in the first place, which determines what will ultimately be even possible to see again, to re-represent, to remember. And this battle over memory is now, battles over memory used to be 5 years, 10 years, decades after the event, after war. But in the era in which we live in, the radicalization of memory takes place as events are unfolding and ongoing. And the battle over memory includes that taken up by organizations dedicated to the collection and archiving and analysis of digital information, documenting human rights violations and international crimes such as Mnemonic and Bellingcat. And Mnemonic there, preserving documents of alleged human rights. So in terms of the scale of digital content I've been talking about, these are also perhaps the new guardians of the archives and remembrance of war. So I spoke with Mnemonic, who told me that over the 10 years of the Syrian war, they've gathered 40 years of footage. That's 3.5 to 4 million records for Syria, equivalent to 40 years. When I was told 40 years, I said, excuse me, can you just say that again? 40 years of footage. And each record is a tweet or a message or an image or a video. For Ukraine, in the first 150 days of the war, they'd already gathered over 1 million records. That's over a decade's worth of footage in 150 days. This just gives you just some glimpse at the scale of what is being recorded. And, these materials are gathered by one NGO, so only a fraction of content that is actually in existence relating to recording of this war. And, I always come back to a kind of late 20th century comparison. We've gone a shift from hundreds of hours of footage to decades worth that, is beyond human comprehension and intelligibility. So we need automation to make sense of it. And I can talk more about this if people want me to. So in the late 20th century, we used to imagine medium war through its potential archives of TV or radio recordings of perhaps 100 hours of footage. I did my PhD in the 1990s, looking at the TV coverage of the 1991 Gulf War, and I had hundreds of hours of footage, and I thought, well, I can produce quite a comprehensive analysis and make certain claims on the basis of the completeness, the relative completeness of my corpus, So we used to derive, I think, a sense of completeness of analysis in collecting and mining and understanding the archival record of the media documenting events. That's how we used to see, certainly a lot of 20th century media. We could analyze all of it. But today, what does it all add up to? How, when, and where will it be used, and by who? How can we possibly make sense of this? A journalist recently explained to me that a month after the beginning of this war in the Ukraine at least, news audiences dropped off a cliff. And if the most documented event in history cannot hold attention, then what can? In terms of the future, as Pomerantsev, I think, nicely argues, of all the digital contents and of atrocities being collected by NGOs, an array of all these organizations, pursuing justice and accountability. It's as much archive as we have ever had related to torture, mass media, and war and crimes, and it sits there waiting for facts to be given meaning. So this astonishing volume of availability of digital content prohibits perhaps a meaningful memory of war from coming into being. The unfolding war in Ukraine seems incredibly available in real-time coverage, but what is actually humanly accessible and intelligible? So whereas wars of the 20th century are marked by the memory booms, the future potential of this war, we are entering into what I call a fourth memory boom, characterized by an individualization, yet also a massification of memory. I mean, we can still say, I think, the potential for the collected archive to remind anew for new purposes to new ends has never been greater. And I think Mnemonic are doing some very interesting work here. This, of course, could be useful in the prosecution of international law, such as war crimes and breaches of the Geneva Convention. But still, there's the need for the international political will and the financial resources to prosecute war crimes at scale, and I'm skeptical if this will ever happen. At a cultural and collective level, we have archives without meaning. So what the present might look like in the future and what it might be useful is now increasingly in the hands of private companies and platforms and their interrelations with militaries and with states. Okay, so let me try and sum up all of this relatively briefly. Perhaps the mediatization of war has morphed into the weaponization of the media. Soldiers, civilians, journalists, victims, aid workers, presidents, journalists, all recording, uploading their experience and vision of events, second by second, tracking every twist and turn. The battlefield seems open to all in the war feed. The war feed renders the war in and against Ukraine up close and personal. Never before have so many images and videos of human suffering and death in war been so quickly available, streaming for the battlefield. Nor has such media content ever been weaponized so quickly and on such a scale as trophies, as propaganda, as blunt psychological warfare. This weaponization is also crowdsourced, a digital multitude posting, liking, sharing, and applauding each individual image or short-form video are all participants engaged in a fractalized kind of psychological war. Meanwhile, the mainstream media look on, or rather they look past Telegram, unable to show what is shown there. The debates over why and how social media platforms should be moderated, regulated, or outlawed in response to claims as to their seeding of misinformation and disinformation and propaganda, and much of that content, generally pixelated on mainstream news outlets, if used at all, that has intensified in recent years. Yet an unsanitized and uncensored war rages on in plain sight. At the same time, digital media do offer new potential in some ways for an amazingly rich future memory and history of the experience and the consequences of war. And the millions of messages, images, and video pouring out the smartphones in Ukraine as I speak surely make this the most documented and the most personalized war in history. And in some feeds, the most sanitized, and in others, the least. But this is no panacea for either understanding or for remembrance. Instead, platforms and apps make war and memory in their own image through the seed for attention, disinformation, splintered realities. Choose your own feed, select your own memory. And ultimately, for me, this is a radicalization of memory. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for a wonderful lecture, inspiring and full of important information and knowledge. And thank you all for coming here and taking part in our discussion. Now, 5 minutes of break, and please use the link to the closed part of the workshop. And we will see there in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.